Death Korps of Krieg are the soldiers the Imperium calls when a siege has gone on too long, when the dead have piled up past what any other regiment can take, and when the only way forward means losses that would break a normal fighting force in days. They do not retreat, they do not question their orders, and they walk into fire that should kill them, take it, and keep moving. Not because someone tells them to, but because dying in service of the Emperor is the purpose their entire civilization was shaped around. Over centuries of war, the Death Korps became known as an exceptionally reliable and loyal fighting force, one the Imperium turns to when no other regiment will do. They are the force that breaks sieges other armies walk away from, that holds ground other soldiers could not survive, and that keeps advancing into conditions so bad that those in power send them precisely because no one else will go. But that loyalty was never something they chose for themselves, because the gas masks, the trench lines, and the willingness to keep advancing long after any reasonable person would have stopped, none of it came from pride or tradition or a genuine belief in what they were fighting for. All of it traces back to a single act of rebellion that destroyed their world, poisoned its air for centuries, and left every generation that followed carrying a debt they never agreed to, for ancestors they never knew, towards an Imperium that has never once told them the debt has been settled. Every life spent, every regiment destroyed, and every war zone the Death Korps leaves behind as a field of their own dead is another payment towards something that may never have a final number. Soldiers who make those payments were not born believing that dying was their purpose. They were built to believe it, shaped by 15 generations of war and guilt, and those who shaped them have never shown any interest in telling them when the account might close. What makes the Death Korps so difficult to look away from is not that they're willing to die, because soldiers everywhere accept death as part of the job. What sets them apart is the reason behind it, and to understand that reason, the story has to begin long before the gas masks and the trench lines, long before 500 years of underground war, and long before the decision that ended the world as everyone on it had known it. To understand what the Death Korps became, you first have to understand what their world did to itself, and why they have never once been given a reason to stop paying for it. Chapter 1. SECESSION of Krieg. Before it became a wasteland, the planet worked. Situated within the Segmentum Tempestus, it was a large hive world home to billions of people spread across 3 massive cities, Hive Oros, Hive Argentis, and Hive Ferrograd. Its economy ran on trade and heavy manufacturing, its soldiers served in the Astra Militarum, and its resources flowed steadily to the Departmentum Unitorum, the Empire's department responsible for managing military supplies across the galaxy. From the outside, it looked exactly like the kind of world those in power valued: productive, reliable, and easy to manage. However, the people running it had decided that was no longer enough. In the book Imperial Armor Volume 5, the planet's ruling class, known as the Autocrats, governed through a council drawn from all 3 hive cities, and had grown increasingly corrupt over time, focused almost entirely on holding onto their own power. They deeply resented the Imperial tithes, convinced that the planet's success was entirely their own doing, and that the demands placed on them by the War Department gave almost nothing back. So they began quietly moving resources away from their obligations and towards something far more dangerous. They strengthened their hive city defenses, built private armies loyal only to themselves, and constructed a network of planetary defense batteries strong enough to hold off a full Imperial fleet. None of it was a sudden reaction. It was a slow, careful process that unfolded over years, and no one had any idea was happening. They were not just angry about their tithes, they were preparing for war. When the High Autocrat made his move in 433 M40, not every city fell with the others. High Ferrograd remained in Loyalist hands under Colonel Yerton, commander of the 83rd Regiment, a man deeply committed to the Imperial cause, who refused to recognize the Declaration and immediately declared for the Emperor. His presence in one of the planet's 3 great cities was a problem the Council had not fully accounted for, and the chairman of the Autocrats, the de facto planetary governor, made no effort to hide his contempt for the colonel. Everyone on the ruling council knew he would never yield. Keeping a loyal Imperial Guard regiment holding one of their hive cities was a flaw in their plan they had no easy way to fix. On the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, one of the most sacred dates in the Imperial calendar, the High Autocrat declared planet-wide martial law and formally broke away from the Empire. Rebel forces spread quickly across nearly every major hive city. Hive Oros fell firmly under rebel control, and Hive Argentis followed shortly after. Orbital defenses fell into rebel hands, and with them, the ring of defenses surrounding the world. Any Imperial fleet attempting to break through would need to be enormous. As he was quickly informed, no such fleet was available. The chairman had expected the planet's fall to be total. Beregrad was the one failure in an otherwise complete seizure of power, and the rebel leadership dismissed it as a problem time would solve. With the orbital defenses in their hands, and no relief fleet available, there seemed to be no reason to hurry. Back in Beregrad, the commander moved without hesitation, and his next decision locked every loyalist on the planet into a fight they had no choice but to finish. When the city's governor continued to waver between sides, the colonel removed the uncertainty entirely by staging a military coup and placing the hive firmly under his control. Every loyalist remaining on the planet now had somewhere to rally. Beregrad became the only city still holding under the Emperor's authority in an otherwise hostile world. The Codex Astra Militarum, 9th edition, notes that planetary governors across the Empire were permitted to run their worlds largely as they saw fit, provided they met their tithes, which had given the autocrats the room they needed to build their private armies without triggering an immediate response. Communications across the galaxy were also slow and fragile, meaning a rebellious governor who moved quickly could effectively cut a world off from Imperial aid for years, severing the planet's connections to the wider galaxy, eliminating most organized loyalist resistance in days, and leaving one regiment trapped inside a single hive city with no hope of outside help was exactly what the council had done. By almost every measure, the rebellion had won, but what the officer was already thinking about inside Beregrad would change that, and it would not save the world in any sense the word usually carries. Chapter 2: Loyalist Resistance. Beregrad was not built to be a fortress. It was a manufacturing center, a city of industry rather than military walls and defensive gun lines. However, hive cities were designed to endure, with thick outer shells, sealed internal systems, and layers of defense built directly into their structure. And when he took control and turned it into a rallying point for every loyalist left on the planet, he worked with what he had. What he had was far less than what he needed. Numbers were not on his side. Rebel forces numbered in the millions, controlling nearly the entire planet, along with its manufacturing output, food supplies, and population. He had his regiment, whatever loyalists had managed to reach the hive before the siege closed around them, and the city's own resources, surrounded, cut off, and with orders to resist at any cost, and no prospect of reinforcement. The situation looked close to hopeless from the start. What he did have was the 83rd Regiment itself, still in the final stages of mustering when the rebellion began, and Archmagos Griel alongside him, a senior member of the Adeptus Mechanicus who had returned with him from the campaign. Imperial Armor Volume 5 records that the Tech Priest's contribution went far beyond maintaining weapons and vehicles. He went deeper than that, directing his teams into the ancient lower sections of the hive. He expanded the existing network of tunnels beneath the city, moving surface infrastructure underground and out of reach of the rebel bombardments already beginning to fall. Whole sections of Beregrad's populations were relocated into this growing underground network. Manufacturing continued below ground without interruption, and he developed a higher-powered version of the standard lasgun designed to give the Loyalists an edge against a much larger enemy force. Life below the surface was not comfortable, but it was organized. Civilians, soldiers, and tech priests all shared these same sealed corridors and production facilities, existing in a permanent half-light broken only by the glow of forge equipment and the flicker of lumens running on recycled power. Food was rationed, sleep was scheduled around production shifts, and contact with the surface was restricted to armed patrols operating in short rotations before radiation exposure forced them back underground. For the Loyalists trapped inside Farograd, the Hive became their entire world. No one above ground, no news from outside, just the grinding routine of a siege with no visible end, maintained by the belief that holding on was itself a form of resistance. The war settled into a hard standoff, with the rebels holding the planet but unable to crack the Hive, and the Loyalists holding the Hive but unable to break out. Yurton was a man who preferred to handle things himself, with a deep instinct to take direct control of every important decision rather than trust others to carry them out. This made him effective in a crisis, but it also placed enormous pressure on him as the siege dragged on without a clear resolution. 18 months passed without either side gaining a real advantage. He was eventually told that no Imperial fleet of sufficient size was available to breach the planetary defenses. Farograd was on its own. Inside Hive Oros, the chairman was not faring much better. His rebellion, launched with such confidence, was not going as planned. Small resistance cells were operating inside his own stronghold, and as the months wore on without the decisive victory he'd expected, the man who had declared independence for an entire planet began to fall apart. He retreated further into isolation, leaving his generals to manage a war that was grinding everyone down equally. As the siege dragged on with no resolution in sight, Yurton continued to work with what he had, methodical and without visible doubt, while the rebels outside waited for a fortress they lacked the will to storm. Deep beneath Farograd, Greel had found something during his work in the lower levels. A sealed vault containing weapons that predated the current age, ancient devices from the dark age of technology so far removed from the present that even the Mechanicus understood only small pieces of what they were capable of. What the tech priest could determine was enough. Even a single one of these weapons could poison a large region for generations, and used together, they represented a level of destruction that no force on the planet could survive intact. The rebels had no idea what was being prepared inside Farograd. They had been given every reason to believe the siege was going their way, and that confidence would cost them everything. Chapter 3. The Nuclear Purge. Yurton chose his moment with care. On the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, the same sacred date on which the chairman had declared secession years earlier, scores of long-range missiles launched from the heart of Farograd into the sky above the planet. They did not aim at Rebel Hive cities directly. According to Imperial Armor Volume 5, the missiles were sent high into the upper atmosphere, designed to spread lethal radioactive material across the entire planet, rather than destroy any single target. Tons of deadly fallout blanketed the world, carried by wind and pressure into every corner of its surface, and what followed was not a series of explosions, but the slow death of an entire world. Massive storms tore across the surface. Climate collapsed almost immediately, driving the planet into a nuclear winter that blocked out the sun and pushed temperatures to deadly lows. All three Hive cities, once the pride of the ruling class, began to fail. Surface structures crumbled, agricultural systems died, and water supplies became poisoned. Billions died in the process, some quickly in the initial firestorms and atmospheric collapse, and others more slowly from radiation sickness, starvation, and exposure as breathing the open air became a death sentence. None of the rebels had been warned, having dismissed the earlier threat as a tactic, and so their Hive cities had not sealed their ventilation systems. Their populations had not moved underground. When the fallout arrived, it found them completely exposed with no way to stop it. The Loyalists inside Farograd had been prepared, at least to the degree that preparation was possible, against a planet-wide nuclear event. The tech priest's months of work in the lower levels gave them a sealed, working space below the surface. By that point, the population had already been moved underground, ventilation systems were closed, water supplies were protected, and military forces had respirators and protective gear, the same equipment that would eventually become the defining look of the regiment the planet would one day produce. He was among the first to walk out onto the surface after the strike, wearing a heavy coat and a face mask to protect against the toxic air. He went out to see what he had done with his own eyes. What he found was a landscape that no longer resembled anything that had been there before. The craters and ruins of surface structures sat under a sky the color of a bruise, choked with particulate matter that turned the light into something dim and wrong. The air tasted of chemicals through the respirator. Nothing moved except the wind carrying fallout across the broken ground. He stood in it long enough to understand the scale of what the Purge had produced, and then returned inside without speaking to anyone about what he had seen. Without knowing it, he was wearing the uniform that his successors would carry across the galaxy for centuries to come. Before the rebels had fully understood what had happened, the Death Riders moved into action, developed earlier in the war when conventional vehicles had become increasingly difficult to maintain. These cavalry units rode mountains that the Adeptus Mechanicus had heavily engineered far beyond the original horse. Blade-like hooves let them cross terrain that would have stopped any standard cavalry. Drug injection systems kept them fearless in battle, and they could push through injuries that would have killed a lesser creature without slowing down. In the chaotic aftermath of the strike, while rebel forces outside the hive staggered through the fallout, the Death Riders swept through the open ground between positions, striking at weakened enemy lines and returning to safety before radiation exposure became critical. The general survived the initial fallout inside Hive Oros. He watched reports come in from across the planet, seeing the world he had been fighting for turn into a burning wasteland in real time. There was nothing he could do to stop it, nothing to reverse what had already happened, and no path to victory remained for the side he commanded. He retreated to his quarters and sealed himself inside, reportedly taking his own life rather than face what the war had become. The Codex Astro Militarum, 9th edition, makes clear that the atomic purge covered the planet's surface entirely. No partial damage, no region that escaped, and no zone where survivors could breathe freely without protection. Krieg had become a man-made death world, a term reserved for planets with environments so extreme that human life can barely survive on them, and it had done so entirely through its own actions. However, the war did not end, and that is the part that most people do not expect. None of it amounted to a decisive military victory. It was a brutal leveling of the odds that stripped the rebels of their advantages in numbers and resources, while stripping the Loyalist commander of any hope of rebuilding what he had destroyed. Rebel survivors retreated underground, just as the Loyalists had. The Warhammer 40K Munitorum Field Manual confirms that the Purge drove the conflict underground, where it would continue for centuries in facilities rebuilt entirely around the demands of permanent war. He walked back inside after his time on the surface, and what would grow out of that destruction over the next 5 centuries was something neither he nor anyone else on the planet could have imagined. Chapter 4. The Long Civil War. 500 years, 15 generations of human beings, each one born into a world already at war, raised with no memory of what the planet had been before the Purge, and each one dying in a conflict that had started long before their great-great-great-grandparents were alive. The same source puts it plainly, describing what those centuries produced as a pitiless, grinding war of wearing down fought across a landscape of complex trench works, rusting razor wire, and craters so deep that anyone who fell into them was as good as dead. War changed as long wars always do. In the earliest years after the nuclear strike, the fighting still looked something like conventional warfare, with clear factions, organized command structures, and identifiable goals. As the decades passed and the populations on both sides were ground down by radiation, starvation, and constant combat, the conflict became something different entirely. It became a way of life. It was the only way of life anyone on that planet had ever known. Generations of children were born in underground bunkers and raised to fight in a war they had not started. Tens of thousands of miles of tunnels were dug over decades. Underground cities replaced the ruined hive cities above, and factories ran continuously to produce everything a society needed to keep itself going in a state of permanent war. On the surface, the fighting moved yard by yard, tunnel by tunnel, with bayonets and shovels as often as laser guns and artillery pieces. What came out of this period was built around a single principle: keep going until the enemy stops. Massive artillery bombardments came before infantry assaults, meant to weaken enemy positions before soldiers went over the top. and when those soldiers advanced, they advanced in waves. If the first wave was destroyed, the second was already moving. If the second was destroyed, there was a third. Chemical warfare became standard, since the atmosphere was already poisoned, and the use of harmful gas weapons was less of a change than it would have been in a healthy world. Soldiers who survived this environment did not do so by avoiding the poison. They survived by becoming so used to fighting inside it that it no longer slowed them down. What this produced over generations was a particular kind of soldier, one who did not experience the surface the way a normal person would. Going above ground was not an act of courage for these fighters, it was simply a task, no different from any other assigned task, to be carried out until either objective was achieved or the soldier was no longer capable of continuing. The mask was always on, the respirator was always running, the cold was simply the temperature, and the craters and the mud and the bodies were simply the terrain. Soldiers who had grown up underground and trained on the surface their entire lives had already processed every element of that environment long before they saw their first real battle. Over those centuries, the uniform that would eventually define the Death Korps across the galaxy took its final form. Heavy greatcoats were chemically treated to resist toxins, advanced respirator units came with filters and regulators, and Mark 9 helmets were designed to connect directly with the gas masks. Every piece of this gear was a practical answer to the conditions on the surface, not a style choice. Over generations, it became tied so completely to the identity of the people who wore it that it was impossible to imagine one of these soldiers without it. It stopped being just equipment and became a statement about what these people were and what their lives were for. The novel Dead Man Walking records that sustaining a population through 5 centuries of this required measures that the wider empire would have found deeply troubling. Mighty womb birthing techniques were developed, a method for producing soldiers at a rate no natural birth rate could sustain given the losses. Mechanicus authorities considered these methods highly problematic. They were allowed anyway, because the alternative was the collapse of the loyalist population and the permanent loss of the planet. From the moment children were born into this system, they were taught that they carried the guilt of their world's sins, that their ancestors had betrayed the Emperor, that their world had been destroyed as a result, and that every generation owed a debt that could only be paid in service and sacrifice. Some were still young enough to need help with their respirator fittings the first time they were sent to the surface. By the time they reached the battlefield, most had spent their entire lives being told it was the only place they belonged. Training began young and was brutal, designed not to prepare soldiers for difficulty, but to find as quickly as possible who could handle it and who could not. Surface tests involved digging trenches, clearing minefields, navigating the wreckage of ancient war machines, and fighting live fire exercises against other recruits. Casualties even in training were accepted as a normal part of the process. Only the soldiers who came through all of it were considered ready to serve. Final assault on Hive Argentis, one of the last rebel-held positions, showed exactly what 5 centuries of this had produced on both sides. Rebel fighters that the Loyalists found there were barely organized and carrying weapons that barely worked. 5 centuries of grinding war had reduced the rebel cause to soldiers who lacked the strength, the will, and the equipment to put up any real resistance. Loyalists who cleared those final positions were not celebrating a victory, they were completing a task that had taken 500 years. Yurton himself did not live to see the end, dying from the slow damage of years of radiation exposure on the planet he had poisoned, and his passing was recorded as a footnote in a data file without statuses or public ceremony. He had believed throughout his life that there should be no visible difference between an officer and the soldiers under his command, and in death, the planet honored that belief by treating his passing exactly the way he had treated everything else, as a matter of record rather than a matter of grief. In 949 M40, the planet was officially returned to the Imperial fold. Loyalists had won, but what they had won was a radioactive wasteland with no agriculture, no working surface infrastructure, and a population that had known nothing but war for 500 years. Victory had not restored the planet, it had confirmed what the planet had already become, and what it had become was something those in power were about to find extremely useful. Chapter 5. Culture of Repentance. When representatives from the newly reunified world made contact with the Departmentum Unitorum, the administrators they spoke to were not interested in recognizing the Loyalist 5th-century struggle. They were interested in the tithes the planet had missed while it was at war with itself. In their accounting, loyalty was not a credit, it was simply the minimum requirement. The planet's representatives offered 20 fully trained and equipped regiments for immediate deployment without waiting to be asked for a specific number and without asking for time to rebuild. 20 regiments placed on the table at once. Their commanders asked that all of them be sent to the most dangerous war zones available. The Codex Astra Militarum 9th edition describes this not as a strategy, but as something that had been building inside the planet's society for 15 generations. Every survivor was driven by a need to make up for the rebellion, a need so strong it had reorganized every part of their civilization around it. As a society, they decided that the original betrayal was a sin so serious it could not be forgiven through ordinary service and had to be paid for in blood, over and over, without end. Known as the Cult of Sacrifice, this belief ran deeper than religion or tradition. It was so built into the planet's culture that it was impossible to separate from what it meant to be a person from that world. Even the physical environment supported this in ways that went beyond words. Something as simple as their face masks served not just as survival equipment, but as daily reminders of the world's dark past. Every time a soldier put on their mask, they were reminded of why it was necessary. Toxic air outside was a direct result of the rebellion. Even the nuclear winter that had settled permanently over the planet was a direct result of the rebellion. Nothing growing on the surface, no one breathing freely, and the sky above their heads standing as a poisoned record of their ancestors' failure. All of it was a lesson that never stopped repeating. In Dead Men Walking, guilt was placed into children from the moment of birth, well before they could fully understand language, and it never left them. Recruits could be as young as 14 or 15 years old, having already absorbed a lifetime of this teaching before they ever reached a battlefield. They did not need to be convinced to give themselves for the mission, having already accepted that sacrifice was their purpose. Training simply taught them how to carry it out. Adding to the strangeness for anyone encountering the regiment for the first time was the fact that even the gender of a soldier was often impossible to determine. Masks filtered voices and covered every feature. Uniforms concealed everything else, and soldiers who had served alongside these units for months sometimes could not say with certainty who among them were men and who were women. Both served, both trained under these same brutal conditions, and both advanced into the same fire, because in a regiment where names had been replaced with numbers, gender was simply another personal detail that the Cult of Sacrifice had decided was irrelevant. Within the regiment, soldiers were not given names, but numbers. Regimental lists were cold and impersonal, with men and women tracked as replaceable resources rather than individuals. A soldier's death was recorded the same way a spent artillery shell was recorded, as an expense that needed to be replaced, with no note for who they were or what they might have done if they'd survived. Soldiers who were injured badly enough to be removed from military service and returned to civilian life did not find sympathy waiting for them. A culture that viewed the maximum sacrifice as the only acceptable outcome had very little space for those who had fallen short of it, even through no fault of their own. Returned soldiers were reassigned to factory work or supply roles, positions considered necessary but carrying none of the weight that combat service held in the planet's social structure. They were not shamed openly, they were simply treated as though they'd become a different category of person, one that the society acknowledged but did not honor. Many of them volunteered for surface duties, knowing they would not survive long enough to be sent back again, preferring a death that fit the culture's expectations over a life that did not. The Cult of Sacrifice did not require its followers to feel good about dying, it only required them to accept it. For soldiers who had already been shaped by that belief from birth, the acceptance came easily. The alternative was harder to live with than the trench. Sustaining a population through 5 more centuries of war required measures that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. With the Adeptus Mechanicus deeply reluctant, Mighty Womb birthing technology was adopted anyway, because the alternative was the collapse of the Loyalist population before the war could be won. Those who could not fight were put to work in the underground manufactorums, producing weapons and supplies without pause. Cases of insubordination within these communities were virtually unheard of. The planet had removed the capacity for it across 15 generations, replacing it with purpose, discipline, and the complete certainty that death in the Emperor's name was the only meaningful thing available to them. This was the culture that greeted those in power when the planet returned to the fold, and it was about to produce something the War Department had never seen before. Chapter 6: Birth of the Death Korps. 20 regiments offered to the Departmentum Unitorum in 949 M40 were not a gesture. Imperial Armor Volume 5 records these units as fully formed, trained, and equipped, not raw recruits hastily put together to meet a quota, but veteran siege troops shaped by the most brutal warfare the planet had ever seen. War Department administrators had expected to negotiate. Instead, they received something they had not been prepared for: soldiers who wanted to be sent to the worst possible war zones and were already capable of surviving them. Formally designated as the Death Korps, the name made official what the soldiers had already been calling themselves since the closing years of the Civil War. Its name was not chosen for its sound, it was chosen because it was accurate. These were people who had made peace with dying long before anyone in the wider galaxy knew they existed, and the military approach they brought with them was a direct continuation of what had kept the Loyalists alive across 15 generations. Siege and trench warfare, massive artillery bombardments followed by relentless infantry assaults, and the deliberate use of human waves as a primary tool rather than a last resort. Rather than outthink the enemy, they tried to outlast them, absorbing more punishment than the enemy could endure delivering, and pushing forward until there was nothing left to stop them. Because of this approach, training within the Death Korps was built not to prepare soldiers for difficulty, but to find and remove those who could not handle it. Rank within the regiment reflected the culture that had built it, with no noble class, no inherited position, and no path to leadership except surviving long enough to earn it. The Imperial Armor Index, Forces of the Astra Militarum, details that officers were drawn entirely from veterans who had survived extended service. First among the non-commissioned ranks was the Watchmaster, the rough equivalent of a sergeant in other Imperial Guard formations. They served as squad leaders and were responsible for training raw recruits into the discipline and approach to sacrifice that defined the regiment. Not appointed from above, they survived into the role, and the fact that they had survived was itself the qualification. At the core of the regiment's fighting strength sat the basic Death Korps infantry squad, organized into 10 or 20-man formations, built to absorb enormous casualties while continuing to advance. Grenadier storm squads were drawn from survivors of destroyed infantry units, soldiers considered to have already lived too long. They were given heavier armor, hellgun packs, and the job of leading charges into prepared enemy positions. Their skull-face masks carried a specific meaning within the regiment's culture: total acceptance of their own death. Its look was not what drove the choice of symbol, honesty was. Combat engineer squads handled the underground warfare that the planets had mastered during the Civil War, armed with shotguns, gas grenades, acid gas bombs, and specialist digging equipment. They dug offensive tunnels beneath enemy lines and broke through them at close range, and fighting that followed a successful tunnel breach was short, vicious, and extremely costly for everyone involved. Engineers understood this going in, because the cult of sacrifice did not recognize hesitation as an acceptable response to a dangerous order. The quartermaster cadre replaced standard battlefield medics entirely, and what they did instead told you everything you needed to know about how the regiment valued human life. Recovering arms and equipment from fallen soldiers was their primary role. A lasgun that could be reissued was considered more valuable than the medical resources needed to save a soldier who might not return to full fighting strength in time to matter. For the seriously wounded who could not be quickly returned to the line, quartermasters carried out honorable field executions before collecting the body's useful supplies. Beyond this, they tracked battlefield data, recording ammunition usage, casualty rates, and territorial gains to give the regiment's command a clearer picture of how each engagement was developing. Managing death efficiently was only part of it. Every death also had to produce useful information for the fights that followed. In Imperial Armor Volume 6, the Mechanicus grew the Death Rider mounts in cloning vats deep below the surface. monitoring every stage of their development carefully, and the resulting animals were engineered far beyond the original horse. Blade-like hooves let them cross terrain that would have stopped any standard cavalry. Drug injection systems kept them fearless in battle, and they could push through injuries that would have killed a lesser creature without slowing down. Riders had to constantly monitor the chemical balance of their mount, injecting stabilizing compounds at regular intervals to keep the animal working. It was an unusual partnership, requiring a degree of independent judgment that was actively discouraged everywhere else in the regiment. An exception existed because the Death Riders served a purpose the infantry could not fill, and even in a culture that removed individual thinking, the battlefield created spaces where it was necessary. Soldiers did not go by names within the regiment. Trainees who mentioned their own names were punished for it. Every member of that formation existed as a number, organized around a shared purpose, advancing towards a shared goal, and dying in service of a debt that had been created before any of them were born. For the Imperial Guard formations that fought alongside them in those early deployments, the experience was difficult to process. Most soldiers in other regiments had commissars to keep them in line, comrades they trusted, and some expectation that their lives had value beyond their combat effectiveness. Serving next to the Death Korps stripped away every comfortable assumption that came with those things. A regiment that collected its dead's equipment before the battle was over, that never removed its masks, that recorded a soldier's death the same way it recorded the expenditure of ammunition, did not feel like a unit of the same army. It felt like something assembled for a purpose that no one had fully explained to the people it was assembled from. Other regiments fought alongside the Death Korps. Very few of them reported enjoying the experience. Every engagement was an opportunity for payment, and what that payment looked like on the largest battlefields the regiment would ever fight was something those in power were about to find out firsthand. Chapter 7: Wars of Atonement. The Death Korps entered the wider galaxy's awareness through performance, not reputation. When the regiment was first deployed into war zones that had held other Imperial Guard formations back, it did not hold back. Standoffs that had lasted for decades were broken in months. Situations described as needing the mass use of penal troops were resolved through the regiment's straightforward approach. Artillery bombardment, infantry assault, relentless pressure, no retreat. Response from the Departmentum Unitorum was immediate. By decree of the High Lords of Terra, planet's tide level was set at the absolute maximum possible for its population and remained there permanently. Its entire social and industrial output pointed towards producing soldiers. Where a comparable planet might have contributed 1 or 2 regiments per year, the Death Korps were now expected to produce 10 times that number. Everything the regiment had built itself into was about to be tested at Vrax. The book Imperial Armor Volume 5 details that it was a Departmentum Unitorum armory world that fell to a rebellion led by a rogue cardinal named Zafan. His movement had begun as a religious one, gathering followers through a combination of genuine faith and growing personal power, until the Inquisition determined he had accumulated too much of both. An assassination attempt was organized against him. It failed. When the population there learned the Empire had tried to kill their religious leader, they rose in his defense. Zafan declared independence, fortified the planet heavily, and the war began. Responding with the 88th Siege Army, assembled almost entirely from Death Korps regiments, Imperial planners had assessed the situation and determined that a swift assault was not possible. Fortifications were too strong, defenders too numerous, and the planet too valuable to destroy from orbit. What the campaign required was a long grinding war of wearing the enemy down, and the regiment was selected precisely because they excelled in exactly that kind of slow, costly work. Millions of soldiers from the Death Korps were sent to dig trenches across Vrax, and the cost started on the very first day. In the first assault on the outer defenses, the 149th Regiment was effectively destroyed, roughly 80,000 men killed or captured in just 2 days of fighting. It was not treated as an exceptional event requiring a change of strategy. Accepted as part of the mathematics of the operation, it was written off. Its losses tallied alongside fuel consumption rates and artillery usage, and the next formation moved into position. By the end of the campaign's first year, the siege had become a war that would be measured in years rather than months, and in regiments consumed rather than positions taken. Hundreds of miles of earthworks stretched across the planet, and neither side could break the other's line quickly enough to matter. What the operation produced instead was a slow arithmetic of attrition, formations written off and replaced, ground gained by meters, the same calculations run again the following week with different numbers. For the Death Korps, this tempo was not a burden. They had been built for exactly this kind of war, and had spent 5 centuries practicing it on their own world. For every other formation assigned to the siege alongside them, the grinding pace and endless cost were things they had to learn to endure without any of the conditioning that made endurance possible. Colonel Tyborg of the 261st Siege Regiment arrived in the campaign's early stages as one of many officers managing one of many formations. Nothing about his entry into the campaign suggested he would still be fighting nearly 2 decades later. He simply took his position and began doing what Death Korps officers were trained to do, advancing under fire and trusting that whatever came next could be absorbed the same way everything before it had been. His first wound came early. He returned to the line. In the campaign's opening stages, the Alpha Legion, a warband of Chaos Space Marines, arrived to reinforce Zaphan's defenders, drawing the Dark Angels chapter of the Adeptus Astartes into the fight. Supreme Grandmaster Azrael committed the chapter heavily to the response, and their involvement helped break the grip on the campaign, forcing the Chaos Marines to retreat. However, the warband had already called for reinforcement through the Eye of Terror before pulling back, and what answered those calls changed the nature of the war entirely. Warbands of war leaders arrived, Iron Warriors followed, Black Legion forces poured through behind them, accompanied by corrupted titans and masses of mutant fighters. A campaign that had already cost tens of thousands of lives per engagement became something far worse, and his regiment was in the center of it. A war that had already been expensive became one that threatened to consume every formation sent into it. Tyborg took a second wound, a third. He returned to the line after each one. In the Death Korps, an officer who directed the battle from safety had failed by the regiment's own standard, and a commander who lost that standing had lost the only authority that mattered. Commissar General Ma, the senior political officer attached to these forces, faced a challenge unlike anything in the standard commissar's role. In Imperial Armor Volume 7, political officers assigned to other Imperial Guard formations spent their time managing morale, pushing soldiers to fight harder, and executing those who ran. Attached to the Death Korps, an officer in that role had almost none of these responsibilities. None of them needed encouragement. None of them were going to retreat. Ma's role was primarily to act as a liaison, managing the friction between the Death Korps and the other Imperial units who found their methods deeply unsettling. He was killed in action when the Chaos Lord Zufar led a counterattack that struck his position while he commanded from his Leman Russ tank. The regiment recorded his death the same way they recorded everything else. 14 years into the campaign, the Ordo Malleus, the Inquisition's chamber dedicated to fighting chaos, became directly involved. Estimates at that point placed the dead at between 6 and 8 million soldiers. He had been wounded 7 times by then. Joining the later stages, the Red Scorpion Space Marine chapter requested specifically the most dangerous mission available at the St. Leonis Gate, apparently unwilling to have their military record measured alongside a regular Imperial Guard regiment, even one as capable as the Death Korps. Tyborg's 8th wound came in the campaign's final stages. His 9th came during the assault on the Citadel itself, the hardest fighting of a war built entirely of hard fighting, when the 261st was broken apart in a matter of days. Most of the regiment that had survived nearly 2 decades of siege warfare made the ultimate sacrifice in that final push. Tyborg, having led them through 9 wounds and almost 20 years of war, watched his formation destroyed around him and kept going, because the Death Korps had no other setting. By the time the last position on Vrax fell, the regiment had buried approximately 14 million of its own soldiers in that world. Then, Inquisitor Lord Hector Rex issued his order. The same volume records that he placed the entire system under a permanent ban and declared the world lost to the Empire forever, a world that 14 million soldiers had died to reclaim, now covered in the bones of the fallen, was ruled too damaged and too tainted to be worth keeping. It was written off without ceremony, and the regiment moved on to the next war zone. Every engagement, won or lost, was another step in the long process of paying back what their world had done. And what that process was actually building towards was something those in power had long since decided not to examine too closely. Chapter 8: Legacy of Krieg. The Imperium's most loyal soldiers were also its most trapped ones. It had been true from the moment 20 regiments stood before the Departamento Munitorum and asked to be sent to the worst postings available, and by the 41st millennium, it had long since stopped being a contradiction. It had become a policy no one needed to write down. The Codex Astra Militarum 9th edition describes Krieg in that millennium as a world with no agriculture, no real civilian economy, and no industry not directly tied to producing soldiers and the equipment they needed to fight. Underground cities built during the Civil War had become permanent settlements running without pause to manufacture weapons, grow soldiers in vitae-womb facilities, and prepare the next generation for surface tests. The planet produced 10 times the number of regiments a comparable world would contribute in a given year. Regiment after regiment equipped and ready for immediate deployment to the worst war zones available. Even the High Lords of Terra had officially approved this technology that the Adeptus Mechanicus had once considered deeply troubling. Fewer soldiers was not something those in power could afford. Similar thinking applied to everyone else about how it all functioned. This doctrine, removal of personal identity, replacement of names with numbers, the quartermaster practice of recovering equipment from the fallen before the battle was fully over, all of it was known, all of it was permitted, because the results were too useful to question. That word, useful, is where the history of this regiment becomes something harder to look away from. This doctrine taught every child born in that world that the rebellion of 433 M40 was a sin so serious it could only be repaid in blood. It taught that the debt was real, that it was personal, and that the only acceptable response to inheriting it was to spend a life paying it down. What it did not teach, and what no authority ever made clear, was what a settled debt would eventually look like. No stated condition existed for the account to close, no number of regiments offered, no campaigns completed, and no wars won would trigger a formal statement that the debt had been paid. Always present, always outstanding, always requiring another payment. It simply never went away. From their perspective, this was not an oversight. A society that believed its debt had been settled would stop volunteering for the worst wars in the galaxy. It would stop offering 20 regiments at once and asking to be sent to the most dangerous postings available. It would stop producing soldiers in vitae-wombs and measuring every life by its usefulness to a mission. An unresolvable debt was not a flaw in the arrangement, it was the arrangement. Those in power had watched the planet function at maximum output since 949 M40 without ever once suggesting the account might be approaching zero. Its position had been made clear without ever needing to be said out loud. In the novel Dead Men Walking, the soldiers produced by the system were not inhuman. They were stripped of their humanity, and the distinction matters. Being stripped of something implies it was taken. It means the people under the masks once had the capacity for things that had been deliberately removed, built out of them by a system that needed them to function a certain way rather than live as people. Every soldier born there who had no name, no face, no bonds with comrades, and no hope for anything beyond a meaningful death in service of an unchosen debt was made that way, not by choice, but by design. And those who built them had understood exactly what they were building, since at least the moment they received 20 fully trained regiments and immediately raised the planet's tithe to the maximum possible. What began on the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension in 433 M40 had been paid in blood on wars across the galaxy, in wars most of these soldiers never knew the names of. At that armory, 14 million soldiers died to reclaim a world immediately declared lost forever. It continued to be paid in every trench dug, every wave sent forward, and every number crossed off a list that had no room for names. Krieg continued to send its soldiers into the worst wars in the galaxy, each one carrying a debt placed on them before they were born. The Imperium continued to point them at the next war zone, having long since decided that soldiers this reliable were too useful to ever be told the debt was paid. The Inquisition that sent him back to his home world is the most powerful and feared institution in existence, with a history of decisions far darker than anything seen here. And the Chaos Space Marines who answered Zaphen's call at Vrax each stood at a different level of corruption and devotion to the Dark Gods. A hierarchy that begins with a soldier who turned his back on the Empire and ended somewhere the galaxy was never meant to see.